What would you call an artist that recorded only 3 albums, none of which sold more than 5,000 copies on initial release? Probably not an overnight success. But sometimes, luckily, time knows how to put things in place. And decades after Nick Drake finished writing his last songs, he is now regarded as one of the most influential acoustic singer-songwriters ever. From his early life and first contact with music to his untimely departure, today we will explore the life of a genius that was ahead of his time. But more importantly, I will try to answer the most important question. What made him so special? I was first introduced to Nick Drake's music when I was 16. The uncle of a high school friend was a music lover and passed down the knowledge to her. Knowing that I was learning the guitar and someone who would pay attention to her recommendations, she shared the secret with me. At first, I wasn't too excited about the idea of just a guy playing the guitar and singing calm tunes. I was more of a metalhead back then, but finally, I gave it a chance. Nick's music felt like a warm embrace, and I completely understood what was all the hype about. 15 or so years have passed since the first listen, but the feeling that music evokes is still the same. They say that good things are better if they are scarce, and Nick Drake's 31 officially released songs are one of the best examples of this. Mr. Drake was born in 1948 in Yangon, Burma, what was then a British colony. When Nick was 2, the family decided to return to England and establish themselves in Warwickshire, at Tanworth-in-Arden, south of Birmingham. As a child, Drake showed an early talent for music. He began playing the piano at the age of 6 and soon added the guitar to his repertoire. By the time he was a teenager, he was already writing his own songs and performing at local folk clubs. In 1967, Nick enrolled at Cambridge University to study English literature. While there, he began to focus more on his music and less on his studies. He recorded a demo tape of his songs and sent it to Island Records, which eventually signed him to a recording contract. Drake's first album, 5 Leaves Left, was released in 1969. It was a quiet, introspective album that showcased his delicate guitar playing and his melancholic lyrics. Although the album received fairly positive reviews, it did not sell well, something that incredibly was the norm for all of Nick's career while he was alive. Drake's second album, Brighter Later, was released in 1970. It featured a more upbeat, jazzy sound, and Drake's lyrics were more introspective than ever. The album was more successful than his first, but it still did not perform well enough to make Drake a household name. His third and final album, Pink Moon, was released in 1972. It was a departure from his earlier work, featuring only Drake's voice and guitar. The album was recorded in just 2 nights, and is widely considered to be Drake's masterpiece. And if you just listen to its 2 first songs back-to-back, you will understand why. But it seems that people from his time didn't think the same. And sadly, not even such beautiful piece of art was enough to charm bigger audiences. Was it the cultural context back then? Or was it just sheer bad luck of those songs not being heard by the right person at the right time? We will never know. And what's sadder is that shortly after the album was done, Nick became increasingly reclusive. He stopped performing live and rarely left his parents' house in Tanworth-in-Arden. Depression and alcoholism took over him as he became increasingly isolated from his friends and family. In 1974, at the age of 26, Nick was found dead in his bedroom after overdosing on antidepressants. Many people speculate he ended his life on purpose. There's probably no point in overanalyzing mental illness, but I couldn't help to always wonder if things would have been different where he had the recognition that he deserved while he was alive. And one can neither put the blame on anyone else, since awareness about such a silent disease as this was not a thing back then. But even so, he wasn't left alone during his struggle. His family supported and persuaded him to visit a psychiatrist, and he was treated with the antidepressants that ultimately became his demise. He was never comfortable with the treatment, however, and probably because of embarrassment, he even hid his condition from friends. Producers and label executives from the time blamed the failure of his albums, especially Brighter Later, on his unwillingness to promote them as any other artist would do. Now we know he was just incapable of doing so at the time, and one can only imagine the pressure he went through during that period. His sister recalls him once saying that it was during this period when everything started going wrong. I mentioned I was working on this video to my girlfriend yesterday while we were driving, and told her about Nick's story briefly, as she didn't know about him. She pointed out immediately that it sounded an awful lot like Vincent van Gogh's life. And that's true. The Dutch artist also was a one-of-a-kind genius with a sensibility that was clearly ahead of his time. Vincent spent a considerable chunk of his life going in and out of psychiatric hospitals, moving between periods of complete creative paralysis, stalked by depression, to masterpiece painting frenzies. Van Gogh ultimately shot himself in 1890 and died 2 days later. That was about 60 years before Nick Drake was born. And what you probably don't know is that, very much like Nick, Van Gogh was never recognized as the genius he was while he lived. Vincent transited all of his life in poverty, at many points depending on the help from his brother Theo to make ends meet. Of over 800 oil paintings and 700 drawings that he produced during his time, only one was sold before his passing. Isn't that ridiculous in retrospect? The most acclaimed painter in the world never knew he was good enough, and neither did Nick. But the most pressing question here, especially if you are not that familiar with his tunes, is probably, what made Nick so special? And that's hard to put into words. His better work, in my opinion, can be described as just a guy with a guitar, singing. And it wouldn't be untruthful, but it wouldn't be fair either. He was way more than that. To begin with, Nick rarely used standard tunings in his guitars. There's no inherent merit in that, but I think that's a big factor of what makes his sound so recognizable. You see, when you change how the strings of a guitar are tuned, especially the relationship between their individual pitches, all of the textbook basic shapes for chords stop working. And this, rather than a complication, is an invitation to discover new ways of saying what you feel needs to be said with the instrument. New ways of combining notes into chords become available, and while the guitar still sounds like a guitar, to me it feels like there's some added mystery to it. And that's a word that can also describe Nick's music. It is ultimately mysterious. Mr. Drake also didn't shy away from odd time signatures, and he had an excellent feel for musical time. Although complexity or musical literacy was never the center focal point of his music. I think that his song Riverman is a great example of what I'm describing here. The thing is that when you listen to it, it all just sounds so natural, warm, and embracing. It could also be described as dark, but there's a way his heart shows through all of his music that makes me feel that there's no possible malice behind any of it all. He was just a sad guy that never could completely grasp what was happening around him and make a place for himself where he could fit comfortably. And as someone deeply interested in literature, his lyrics were just on another level, and many were just an overwhelming cry about his unease with life. In his songs, he painted pictures with sparse brushstrokes, leaving just enough for the listener's imagination to fill in the rest. Although probably every image suggested had a special meaning to him, it all can make sense in different ways, depending on the context and will of the listener. Simplicity is perhaps another way of putting words to his style, but his minimalism was calculated and a foundational piece of his aesthetic. His songs rarely surpassed the 3-minute runtime, and that was enough and perfect. He had a soft and fragile voice, but with a register that could go as deep as he ever needed to convey his tragedies and joys. The phrasing among his verses is commonly shifted slightly when melodies are repeated with new words, giving a new emphasis to the music and keeping the listener engaged with new points of view over recently passed passages. It was just a young guy with a guitar for most of it. But while one can try and rationalize the things he did and did not do in his music, there will never be anyone like him again. Nick's music was like a fire that kept burning quietly for decades after he was gone. It was too good to be kept secret among those in the know. But dating exactly what ignited his current popularity is pretty much impossible. It is known that many famous artists from the 80s and 90s knew about Nick and that he was a big inspiration for them. Bands the like of R.E.M. and The Cure had gone on record recognizing the artist's greatness. In 1994, a compilation album was put together and was named Way to Blue. It included tracks from Nick's original 3 albums and some songs from Time of No Reply, an earlier compilation tape comprised of outtakes and alternative versions of his songs. Way to Blue was a success compared to any earlier album from the artist, reaching gold status in the UK and selling over 200,000 copies worldwide. Nick Drake's music started gaining a different level of magnitude in terms of popularity. This was 40 times the reach his songs had when written, nearly 30 years after his death. Probably one of the biggest milestones in Nick's music resurgence was when Volkswagen used Pink Moon as the soundtrack for a 1999 commercial.
I saw it written and I saw it say.
Since then, Nick Drake became a household name among singer-songwriters and someone that was cool to mention among your influences. He had finally made it. Probably at last, it was the right time for his music. The early 2000s, especially in England, took with open arms his somber, sad music, as it was a better cultural fit back then than in the 70s. Nick Drake had the curse of being a creative, bitter soul in the decade of disco. Nowadays, his music has almost 3 million monthly listeners on Spotify. Nobody knows for certain if what ended Nick's life was self-inflicted or an accident. I'm not sure if that matters either. But his sister recalls that when they found him that day, there was a book with him. It was The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. The text starts with the following lines. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. Ironically, the author concludes that essay with the idea that one should oppose suicide as an escape, and instead embrace the absurdity of life. But Nick probably knew Camus' point of view pretty well, and it wasn't enough to convince him.